Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we are going to talk about the agenda to reduce the Earth's population and what it all means. Before we get into that, though, I want to remind you guys to bookmark theconsciousresistance.com, your home for news, analysis, articles, essays, vlogs, documentaries that explore governmental and corporate corruption, that talk about solutions for the problems we face here in the world as a human species, for health, gardening, lots of interesting topics, and conspiracy research, conscious music. You can download books for free. Check out the website. You get the point. Follow us on Steemit. Follow us on Minds. Follow us on Discord. Join us on BitChute. And sign up for our text list. Again, there are 44,000 of you subscribed to this channel, and there are barely any of you subscribed to this text list, which means that if the channel goes down one day, you will not have a way to keep in touch with me, and you might as well assume I'm dead. We'll also ask you to support us on Subscribestar or Patreon for $5, $7 a month. And if you want to subscribe to our email newsletter, it's right there and you can get signed up. So this story is focused on a study that was just released on November 5th. We're now, 2 weeks away from this? But I haven't seen much coverage from it in the independent media, let alone the corporate media. So this is coming from Bioscience. World scientists warn of climate emergency. No, that's nothing new that we haven't seen before, climate emergency. But let's take a little deeper look at this. And we'll skip over most of it because I think we know it, but let's just read some of it. Scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat and to, quote, tell it like it is. On the basis of this obligation and the graphical indicators presented below, we declare, with more than 11,000 scientist signatories from around the world, clearly and unequivocally that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. Exactly 40 years ago, scientists from 50 nations met at the first World Climate Conference in Geneva in 1979 and agreed that the alarming trends for climate change made it urgently necessary to act. Since then, similar alarms have been made through the 1992 Rio Summit, which is where the Agenda 21 documents were first put out, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and the 2015 Paris Agreement, as well as scores of other global assemblies and scientists' explicit warnings of insufficient progress. Now they get into a little bit deeper, but we're going to get to the key points of what we want to know, which is essentially that they are describing that there is a crisis going on. And I will agree, look, I have a video coming out called Decentralized Environmentalism, so that those of you who think that all environmental movements are just part of the globalist agenda for depopulation can see that there are some ways to actually give a shit about the environment, to work with the planet, that don't have to involve giving up your freedoms and giving the state power. But the version of environmentalism that's being promoted in the mainstream is, of course, that very same kind, that will lead to control, lead to more government, and lead to less freedom. A profoundly troubling signs from human activities include sustained increases in both human and ruminant livestock populations, per capita meat production, world gross domestic product, global tree cover loss, fossil fuel consumption, the number of air passengers carried, carbon dioxide emissions, and per capita CO2 emissions. Encouraging signs include decreases in global birth rates, so they can see that as encouraging, decelerated forest loss in the Brazilian Amazon, increases in the consumption of solar and wind power, institutional fossil fuel divestment of more than 7 trillion, and the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions covered by carbon pricing. However, the decline in human fertility rates has substantially slowed during the last 20 years, and the pace of forest loss in Brazil's Amazon has now started to increase again. So basically they're saying, but there's not enough happening. We need to do more. And here we go. This is kind of the key aspects of it right here. It says, despite 40 years of global climate negotiations, with few exceptions, we have generally conducted business as usual and have largely failed to address this predicament. The climate crisis has arrived and is accelerating faster than most scientists expected. It is more severe than anticipated. They like to say that, threatening nature ecosystems and the fate of humanity, according to the IPCC 2019, which of course said that we have 12 years, to do something or the world's going to end. Especially worrisome are potentially irreversible climate tipping points and nature's reinforcing feedbacks that could lead to a catastrophic hothouse Earth well beyond the control of humans. These climate chain reactions could cause significant disruptions to ecosystems, society, and economies, potentially making large areas of Earth uninhabitable. To secure a sustainable future, we must change how we live in ways that improve the vital signs summarized by our graphs. Economic and population growth are among the most important drivers of increases in CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. So population growth. Therefore, we need bold and drastic transformation regarding economic and population policies. We suggest 6 critical and interrelated steps that governments, businesses, and the rest of humanity can take to lessen the worst effects of climate change. These are important steps, but are not the only actions. So again, I'm going to say that there are some genuinely good things listed in here that, that I think each of us could, on the individual decentralized method, take into account and do for ourselves. But then, of course, there's this whole aspect, and they hide this kind of at the bottom, the last 6th one. Population, still increasing by roughly 80 million people per year, or more than 200,000 per day. The world's population must be stabilized, and ideally, gradually reduced, within a framework that ensures social integrity. There are proven and effective policies that strengthen human rights while lowering fertility rates and lessening the impact of population growth. So, there are proven and effective policies that strengthen human rights and lower fertility rates. Now, that's an interesting way to kind of say that. I did look, they reference this study here from 2018, and when you go to that study, you have to basically, you can click here, and you can go through one of these, Google Scholar, PubMed, and if you want to get access to it, I think you got to pay for it. But it would be interesting to see what exactly they're referencing. Let me see if we can get a free version of this real quick. Because you see, they're referencing this study, and they're saying, these policies make family planning services available to all people. Family planning services, I think, is probably, they're talking about birth control, they're talking about condoms, but they're also talking about abortion. Remove barriers to their access and achieve full gender equity, whatever exactly they mean by that, including primary and secondary education as a global norm for all, especially girls and young women. And to me, that just means they want to make sure they can indoctrinate the population. That's just what I'm getting. So they're referencing this study, global warming policy is population left out in the cold, and it does look like you have to pay to get access to it. So if anybody wants to pay or has an account on here, you can send it over to me and we'll look through it further. But that's just kind of an example. So my point here, though, is that they're focusing on population growth. They might not say it as boldly as we might hope, but here in the conclusion, they point to what they're saying. Mitigating and adapting to climate change while honoring the diversity of humans entails major transformations in the ways our global society functions and interacts with natural ecosystems. Now, one point I want to make here is that when you're looking at dry documents like the studies or government documents, or just liars, politicians, it's a common practice for them to kind of downplay certain topics. Like, there's a way you can tell somebody, I want to reduce the Earth's population, and obviously that entails the killing or, the eliminating of certain people, but you don't come out and say, we're going to kill 6 billion people or whatever the number may be, right? You say, well, we need to readdress societal norms about birth and population growth in order to find some effective way to achieve harmony with the planet. Something like that. They really, if you break down the words individually and you look at them, then you're like, okay, so that means this, that means, and, logically it leads to the fact that you would have to reduce the population in some way, but they don't come out and say it. We are encouraged by a recent surge of concern. So think about this. They're encouraged by a recent surge of concern. Global government bodies are making climate emergency declarations. School children are striking. Ecocide lawsuits are proceeding the courts. Grassroots citizens movements, right, are demanding change, and many countries, states, and provinces, cities, and businesses are responding. Now, that's true to some degree, but again, a lot of this is being driven by the non-governmental organizations, the nonprofit industrial complex, and to some degree, the corporations who stand to benefit by being in front of this so-called climate revolution. As the Alliance of World Scientists, we stand ready to assist decision makers in a just transition to a sustainable and equitable future. We urge widespread use of vital signs which will better allow policy makers, the private sector, and the public to understand the magnitude of this crisis. The good news is that such transformative change, with social and economic justice for all, promises far greater human well-being than does business as usual. We believe that the prospects will be greatest if decision makers and all of humanity promptly respond to this warning and the declaration of climate emergency to act to sustain life on planet Earth, our only home. So again, they're talking about reducing the population. There are some good things, like, for example, they say eating mostly plant-based foods while reducing the global consumption of animal products. I can agree with that. They said this will free up croplands for growing much-needed human plant food instead of livestock feed, while releasing some grazing land to support natural climate solutions. Cropping practices such as minimum tillage and that increase soil carbon are vitally important. I would also add permaculture to that. And they also add we need to drastically reduce the amount of food waste. So those are all good ideas done done voluntarily. We don't need government to force these down our throats. I mean, that's what they're arguing for, is that, look, we're at a time and a place where the shit is about to hit the fan. The shit's already hitting the fan. And if we don't have some top-down centralized control to make the change happen, then we're not going to get there. And this is essentially an argument for, well, it's an argument for a global government, and it's an argument for what I would consider eco or green fascism or green totalitarianism, green authoritarianism. And that's important to recognize, because another one of the solutions that we're going to see put forth are geoengineering, and the idea that man needs to start climate engineering and modifying the weather, modifying the climate as the solution. So they're putting forth these crazy, shady technologies as the solution, and they're also putting forth the idea of more government control. This study was done by the Alliance of World Scientists. You can find out more about them at scientistwarning.org. They are a new international assembly of scientists, which is independent of both governmental and non-governmental organizations and corporations. It asserts that in order to prevent widespread misery caused by catastrophic damage to the biosphere, humanity must practice more environmentally sustainable alternative to business as usual. So you can get involved right there, and then we have a little background. The World Scientists Warning to Humanity. In November 2017, 15,000 scientists signed a World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice written by the lead author, William J. Ripple of Oregon State University, which also, go back here, William J. Ripple is the same guy responsible for this most recent letter, along with the 7 co-authors, calling for, among other things, limiting population growth and drastically diminishing per capita consumption. So this guy's been calling for this for a little while now. The article included 13 specific steps humanity could take to transition to sustainability. And again, sustainability isn't necessarily a bad word. Yes, sustainable development in the sense of the United Nations is, again, about control, more government, global government, and some eco-authoritarianism. But that doesn't mean living sustainably and trying to be more sustainable as an individual is a bad thing. As they say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I hate that phrase, but it's true in this case. And so, yeah, this group is in November 19, more than 11,000 scientists from 153 countries named climate change an emergency that would lead to untold human suffering if no big shifts in action take place. I will say, though, they're getting some pushback from places like MIT. You can see right here, critics blast a proposal to curb climate change by halting population growth. More than 11,000 scientists, we just read that. Other researchers immediately criticized one of the proposed remedies, halting population growth. The authors note that effective means of lowering fertility rates include making family planning services more widely available, as we said, but rich nations generally already have flat or declining birth rates. So the proposal largely seems directed at fast-growing developing nations in Africa and Asia. Specifically, the UN projects that 9 countries will account for more than half of projected growth between now and 2050, including India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, United Republic of Tanzania, Indonesia, Egypt, and the U.S., where migration is expected to be the main driver of growth. So Arvind Ravikumar, an assistant professor of energy engineering at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, said on Twitter, quote, "A bunch of white people in the developed world saying population should be reduced is the definition of an imperialist framing. It's actually a eugenicist framing. Eugenics has always been about population control, and whether we like it or not, abortion was a part of the eugenics platform. And now, I'm not saying it has no place for some people, maybe in some way, some instances, but let's just accept the fact that this is all about eugenics. It's population control. It's it's control of the government, control of your diet, control of whether you can drive, whether you can fly, how you can live your very life. So thankfully they're getting some pushback. Joseph Majkut, a climate scientist and director of climate philosophy at the Niskanen Center, a think tank based in D.C., says the suggestion is highly problematic from a political standpoint. It feeds directly into the perception among conservatives that climate science and its conclusions are the product of an ideological movement, one that prioritizes nature over humans. And this is true. I've seen on True Stream Media recently, they were talking about, I think they actually put out a new documentary, The Myth of Extinction, about the group Extinction Rebellion, which is doing direct action about the climate. And I generally agree with that. Like I would agree with it on some cases, but I do think that Extinction Rebellion is not as organic as they would like us to believe, in groups like that just pop up overnight. And, as somebody who does come from a nature-based spirituality, Native American spirituality, yes, I do love and want to live in balance with all that the Creator has put for us on this planet. But that doesn't mean I necessarily worship the nature. I think some people do, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that either. The problem is that it's involuntary, that it's forced. It's government, right? It's government or anybody saying nature is more important than humans, or we need to protect the nature to, preserve human life. So in the interest of that, we're going to take, freedoms away from you, or we're going to force X, Y, and Z on you. So that's the problem, is whenever force is involved, coercion involved, it's always going to be a bad situation. So it has to be voluntarism. A scientific rationale for a smaller world population could also be abused to justify more aggressive tactics of population control, bingo, or racist attitudes towards growing parts of the developing world. Imagine that. Groups like the Rockefeller Foundation and these other groups that have been involved in funding much of the climate science and the movements behind it. Imagine, my surprise to find out that they could be pushing some aggressive population control tactics that are racist towards parts of the developing world. We already know that the Gates Foundation and other organizations have sought to there have been sterilization of individuals in Africa and elsewhere via vaccines that they're being told are, for the good of them. So this is, again, it's a eugenics policy. To some, the proposal drew to mind darker periods in the environmental movement when various organizations and figures promoted pro-eugenics and anti-immigration views. At least MIT is willing to acknowledge it. So fewer people producing less in greenhouse gas emissions could make some difference in the danger that climate change poses over time. But whether we end up with 9, 10, or 11 billion in the coming decades, the world will still be pumping out increasingly risky amounts of climate pollution if we don't fundamentally fix the underlying energy, transportation, and food systems. Now, I agreed with this to some extent. One of the reasons I promote community gardening and localization of decentralization of food production is that if we are having to all depend on California, Mexico, or Iowa for your food, depending on where you're living, that means it has to be driven across the country. So if you care about, the pollution from cars, that's a cost right there. But also there's time, there's money, there's energy. The more that we build local food economy everywhere possible and encourage trade between different decentralized communities like that, the less dependent we are on the mainstream food production system, and the more power we can build locally by having local food economy. It's an important point. So although MIT is basically saying they're not sure that population control is the answer, they are saying that we have to fix the underlying energy, transportation, and food systems, which is true, again, but will that come from a voluntary perspective driven by the people, or will it come from a top-down centralized perspective? So far, it looks like centralization is the order of the day, and as I said, I think that will lead to an eco or green authoritarian system. Many prominent names in climate science are conspicuously absent from the list of signatories, and many researchers who did add their names are in fields outside climate energy. One notable name that does appear is James Hansen, an adjunct professor of Columbia who is considered the father of climate research for his early and influential modeling studies. So yeah, just interesting thing. Some are saying that this study calling for reducing climate change is actually racist, and they at least acknowledge that there are some eugenics history and racist history. Now this, I will point to this article from Activist Post written by Brandon Smith. It's called "The Globalists Are Openly Admitting to Their Population Control Agenda, and That's a Bad Sign." I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but he does a pretty good job of going through some of the early 1900s Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Institute promoting eugenics laws, and some of the early history of eugenics and its connection to the environmental movement, including the Club of Rome, including the UN paper, The Limits of Growth, the Council on Foreign Relations, and other groups who have had a population control agenda for years and for decades now, for generations, and it's just now becoming out in the open. I would even point to this. It's pretty interesting. It says, at the same time that the first global revolution was being published by the Club of Rome and the UN agenda, the UN Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller was publishing his manifesto, which is now collected on a website called Good Morning World. Mueller argues that global governance must be achieved by using the idea of protecting the earth, environmentalism as the key components. Through fear of environmental apocalypse, the public could be convinced to accept global government as a necessary nanny state to keep society from destroying itself. So this has been pushed for quite some time. And there's another, you can see the paper titled Proper Earth Government, a Framework and Ways to Create It, that outlines much of what we're seeing now. And then the article kind of gets into the point where we're at now, where now you have the 2020 presidential candidates who are pushing for things like the Green New Deal. This article says Bernie Sanders argued for birth control measures in poor countries. Elizabeth Warren promoted abortion by saying it was as safe as getting your tonsils removed. And, of course, the Green New Deal and the amount of government control that it requires. So this has been going on for some time, and it's just now becoming more and more bold. And the fact that you have 11,000 scientists from around the world kind of openly calling for population control, I think it says something. And I want to point back to this article I did, I think it was in, 2015, June 2015, when new study says that the Earth is experiencing 6 mass extinction period. A group of scientists from Stanford, Princeton, and the University of California warned that the Earth is experiencing a 6th mass extinction era. And the point that I got to is the second half of this article, which I called, Is Humanity the Problem or Can We Be the Solution? And I basically started to look at some of the people who are involved in that, calling for the 6th mass extinction. And you have the name of Professor Ehrlich. Robert Ehrlich, I think is his name. Let me see where he's at. Paul Ehrlich, the Bing Professor of Population Studies and Biology, Senior Fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for Environment, and co-author of the study that said that without any significant doubt, we are now entering the 6th great mass extinction era. And this guy, though, Professor Ehrlich, has been involved since the late 70s, mid-70s. He wrote the book Extinction in 1981, The Causes and Consequences of the Disappearance of Species. Before that, he also co-wrote Ecoscience, which some of you may remember, was published in 1977 with John Holdren, who was Obama's science czar at the time. Ecoscience promotes a number of radical ideas for dealing with the world's population. Some of these include forced abortions enforced by a global police force, which requires the loss of individual sovereignty. So you can see on the pages on forced abortion, discussing poisoning the water to force fertility control, and Holdren and Ehrlich writing about the global police force. He also went on to, before that, he'd written a book called The Population Bomb, which said that by the 2000s, the population of the U.S. and Britain would be starving en masse because of the increase in size and consumption. Now, you could just say, well, bad science, bad information, but my point is this guy has a history of pushing this kind of information and this 6th mass extinction era, and this is very similar to what we're seeing from the scientists now who are pushing this same idea. So at least MIT was willing to call that out a little bit, and I appreciate that. And I want to invite you guys to check out this. This is a report I did sort of about that topic with the same title, Is Humanity the Problem or Can We Be the Solution? And I'll include that link below. That came out in July 2015 if you want to hear more about that topic and that issue. But we talked yesterday about the vaccine, the push for global vaccines, and basically removing exemptions, and how that relates to what they're calling the digital ID 2020. And that is interconnected with this push for the green movement, the environmental movement. I do think that the fear that I have is that we're moving towards, and some have seen this for quite some time, the writing has been on the wall, but it's becoming more and more clear every day, that we are facing a technocratic, eco-authoritarian, green authoritarian regime all over the world. That many people have talked about that world government was going to be coming for generations, but there hasn't always been a clear understanding of what's it going to look like. Is it going to be communist, socialist, capitalist, authoritarian, fascist, whatever? It seems now that it's going to be a technocratic, using technology, using the tech companies, the big tech companies and corporations, and technology for surveillance, for tracking, monitoring, things like that, 5G, the smart grid, the credit score, all of that, and a national and global ID card in order to access services, mixed with this green eco-authoritarian mindset about protecting the planet and taking freedoms away from people in order to preserve life on the planet. Now, is that best for humanity? Will we look back 200 years from now and say, we survived, thankfully we temporarily, hopefully, adopted that authoritarian mindset so we could force people to live right, and then eventually things settle down and everybody learned to live in harmony with the planet? I hope so. But typically when you give governments this kind of power, it doesn't just easily go away. They don't just drop that power. They wield it, they wield that power and use it to their fullest extent possible, and they're not very quick to give it up. So I hope that people are really thinking this through and will do the research to look into the history of these organizations, even some of the links here in the MIT article, and definitely the links here and this Activist Post article. I recommend checking out all of it, and even my article here about the mass extinction era, to understand some of the scientists and the people pushing this message, so you can really have a grasp on what's going on. We're going to leave it there, but I want to remind you guys that I am still running a Support the Future of the Conscious Resistance Network crowdfunding campaign for 6 more days. If you've enjoyed this report and all the reports I've been dropping lately, please send an investment our way. We've raised $340 so far out of our $2,500 goal. If you can support, instead of buying a coffee cup today, throw it our way so we can keep doing investigations. We got the 5G documentary coming out. We got the Finders update, Epstein update, and my new book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which will give you solutions for many of the problems that we've been discussing lately. So please support where you can, how you can. And until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, you are free. Peace.